The next session is on the broad topic of infrastructure and compliance. I'm Denny Chin. I will be your moderator. In a nutshell, this panel will be looking at the translation of privacy requirements into corporate governance and global operational and technical practices. We have a panel with extensive experience in privacy issues. I'll skip our Kickstarter for now. Next is Katherine Armstrong of Hogan Lovells, who, as I understand it, had 30 years at the FTC before joining the firm. Next is Orrie Dinstein, Global Privacy Leader at Marsh and McLennan. Next is Patrice Ettinger, Chief Privacy Officer at Pfizer. And then at the end is Bill Min of Starwood Hotels. Their biographies are in the materials, and so I won't repeat the bios now. And our Kickstarter is Steve Mutkoski of Microsoft, and as he was just telling me, a former New Yorker who misses New York.
Happy to be back.
Steve?
Great. Let me start by saying I'm going to reflect a kind of an enterprise viewpoint here, and one of the things I'm going to sort of suggest in some of the comments is I support our enterprise businesses, but very often I find there's this blurring between what is enterprise, what is consumer, and so keep that in mind. I think what I'm saying, people initially think, oh, that's very relevant to sort of enterprise cloud services, but is it relevant to the more consumer conversations that we're having? And I think the answer is yes, and in some ways, much of what I'll talk about, I think, foreshadows the way that we should look at regulation in the pure consumer space. 3 key points I want to make. One, I think privacy can really be a competitive differentiator. I think, a lot of the sort of early talk of privacy is dead. It sort of depends on how you ask people these questions, right? But we have found that it is, in fact, it's a very important piece, particularly for our enterprise customers and their end users and customers as well. Second, I really think industry needs to be more, I'm going to say, more constructive in their approach to regulation. I sometimes laugh and think, I still feel really young, but I'm like that older person who's saying, I remember when I used to get up and talk about how regulation was going to kill all innovation. I've successfully lived through an antitrust case that put significant reins on the way we could do contracting business, and helped us move into new businesses like cloud computing, where we had to deal with all kinds of regulations that we never thought of before. My personal belief here is that we're really seeing this already as the cloud matures, going from an era of just pushing back and saying, it's too important, we can't have any regulation here, to really one of saying, let's constructively work with regulators, let's work with constituent groups who have an interest in this area, and let's formulate good, reasonable regulation that actually spurs on further innovation because it builds trust with the people who we want to use these services and actually results in new uses, new business cases that we wouldn't have without some baseline regulation. And sort of third point, specifically on regulatory compliance within a large company, it's a long-term engineering lifecycle process. And it's mistakenly, I think, viewed, particularly in kind of the startup era, as just something, there's a template for what regulation is. You just build stuff against that or ignore it, depending on, what your view on regulation is. And then that's it. You've got products, you services, you throw them out into the marketplace. It's not that way, in fact. It's critical that I say we as sort of policy people in companies have that relationship with engineers to make them understand that, there are going to be regulatory changes. There's going to be evolution. And both that we have to make sure that we have a way to slot those things into engineering, but also to build a partnership with engineering so that we're not just sort of reacting to new regulation, but we're actually helping craft it and crafting it in a way that, in some ways companies have made smart bets about where regulation goes. I think that's sort of the future with some of this. I want to make a couple quick comments around the nuances around those points, so to just make sure we're all on the same page. To me, one of the most fundamental shifts has been the move from what I'll call sort of on-prem enterprise software, where companies set up systems, operate themselves, and when it comes to sort of privacy, security, any other regulatory compliance issues, that entity owns those issues. They know what, they interpret regulations, what they mean, they figure out how to implement controls and processes, and then they figure out how to sort of prove or audit against those things internally. It's very easy. Then along came the cloud. And I remember having a conversation with a big life sciences customer of Microsoft saying, doesn't this cloud thing sound great? It's potentially going to have great cost and agility benefits. And the answer was, I'm not even going to talk about that yet. Do you know about HIPAA? Do you understand what HIPAA is? Do you know that we will consider you to be a business associate, and you will have to enter into a business associate agreement with us? And I remember just thinking, that wasn't our way of looking at this here. We were kind of taking this very potentially narrow reading of HIPAA. In the end, we wound up listening to those customers and going in a very different direction, which was to say we're going to embrace the fact that we're a business associate and actually engineer services so that we can live within that, the constraints. And if you think about the cloud, it's sort of storage, compute, software as service. It's the foundations for a lot of businesses, and a lot of the services that we ultimately hear about, whether it's apps, other services, most of those people are not building their own data centers, right? They're running on top of these commodity foundation infrastructure. So it's important to keep that in mind. I'm not just talking about, what is sort of a Pfizer, what are your concerns about moving to the cloud? There are lots of other examples of people building businesses on top of cloud services. One other interesting historical data point is, if you think about this movement of consumerization of IT that started about 5-6 years ago, as well as that sort of confluence of that, the cloud, and the financial crisis of 2007, it really opened the door for companies, cloud providers, to go basically wedge their services into all sorts of different types of businesses through kind of a side door and really bypass central IT requirements, procurement requirements. I guess my point is now, I think those sort of Wild West days of people, individual employees at like a Goldman Sachs, taking out their corporate American Express card and buying some cycles on AWS to run, a proof of concept without going through any sort of internal compliance and validation. I think those Wild West days they're not done, but they're largely being supplanted by customers that are small, medium, large, doesn't really matter, starting to ask important questions around not just security, but data use, data protection, data privacy type questions of their cloud providers. And that's really led to a lot of teaching from our customers, teaching us as cloud service providers, what are the regulations and restrictions, what's the alphabet soup of things that we need to have in mind. And I think over time, regulatory activity has really validated that approach that we've taken. An example I like to use is there was a small Phoenix Cardiac Surgery Associates, a small medical practice that was using just off-the-shelf consumer email calendaring services. And one of the patients did a Google search, looked up their name, and lo and behold, their surgery appointment pops up and is visible to everybody in the world. Well, they got a $100,000 fine from OCR and HHS for using a non-HIPAA compliant service. And we've seen tons of examples of that, and I think real maturing of companies, like I say, small, medium, large, about what their underlying compliance requirements are, and those needing to be passed on. a couple other quick dynamics. One is, look, we're trying to create hyperscale cloud. I mean, really, at the end of the day, the value propositions that the Microsofts and the Amazons and the Googles and others are creating is we're buying bulk electricity. We're getting huge, discounts on hardware. We're aggregating demand. We're mapping 24-hour cycles around the world. All of that really leads us to want to build, not build data centers everywhere, in everybody's backyard, in everybody's offices. So there's real tension between this litany of requirements with, 190 plus countries. If each country comes up with their own regulatory regime, that's challenging. But this gets to the point I made about constructive engagement with regulators. One of the lessons that we've learned, we made some very early bets around what common denominators would be across the regulated industries we wanted to sell to. And it was clear, advertising and marketing uses of the customer's data, that was one of the things that sort of popped up everywhere. There were other things about data deletion requirements. So we sort of mapped some of those things, and they have largely been helpful for us in translating dozens of different sectoral and geographic requirements, and allowed us to do business quicker, easier, in more places than would otherwise be possible. But when I think about this concept of what is global compliance and how do you do it, again, back to this idea, it's a very long-term life cycle issue. It's interesting that we dealt with, whether it was the UKG cloud framework.
What do you mean by that, a long-term life cycle issue?
Let me give you an example. So about 4 years ago, we addressed a series of requirements that the UK government set forth and said, if you want to sell to public sector authorities in the UK, you must meet all of these requirements. It took a lot of engineering work. We were still sort of figuring out what our full set of regulatory compliance tools was. But once we did that, it would have been a huge mistake for us to think, we're done. We're done in the UK, we're done everywhere. No, we actually then, just about a year ago, the Singapore government came up with a similar framework, but not identical, right? So it required some engineering work. And if we didn't have the discipline built into our engineering groups to understand that it's not just what you think you should be doing, we need these outside inputs from, whether it's from regulators or from government procurement folks, to be able to build these things. But the other piece of life cycle that I think is really important is about foresight to understand where regulation's going. And this is one where, I think we made the smart bet around the advertising uses. We knew there were going to be a bunch of industries where that was just not something that would pass muster. And so we were able to sort of watch regulations come down and even participate in the process of urging on regulation in ways that I think many other people in the industry really were taking a position of no regulation is what we want, it's the best thing. And I think it's one of those things of like sort of splitting the difference. If you're, too far over, I think sometimes your voice doesn't even wind up being considered in what's reasonable and splitting where the difference is. To finish up, just one quick comment around, I'll use the education space as an example, because I think it ties a bunch of these themes together. Many people did not know whether to treat the education sector as a consumer or an enterprise segment. Some of our early discussions particularly with higher ed, they said, actually, you know what, we're more regulated than any other industry because we have every industry's regulations baked into what we do. We have medical colleges, so we have HIPAA, we have very sensitive research funded by the federal government, we have all kinds of financial obligations, so look at us as sort of mega regulated. We took that approach, and over the last 4 years, I've been very involved in sort of mapping out with stakeholders, whether it's people in the technology component of education, people in the administrative section, other ed tech other companies that work in ed tech, what are the requirements for your field? And they actually look quite different today than they did 3 or 4 years ago. And you've probably seen things like we did a lot of work in the industry to create consensus around some data use restrictions, which culminated in an industry privacy pledge, something that was favorably mentioned by President Obama in several speeches, including in his State of the Union. And that's actually led to legislative proposals that I would say look a lot more like the kind of well-worded, carefully crafted, narrowly drafted regulatory proposals that we would like to see, as opposed to something that's overly restrictive. And so I think that involvement, it's not only the internal work that you do, it's the external work to really engage with stakeholders and regulators to make sure that the regulation that comes about is something you can work with long term.
All right, well, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about. Maybe we could just take it back a step a bit and just talk about how much regulation is out there, what agencies are involved. Even within the U.S., there seem to be many agencies addressing the issue. How difficult is it to comply for yourselves or your clients? And maybe some of the panelists could just lay some of the groundwork before we get into some of the other issues.
Well, I'll start. So first of all, I know my bio is in the package, but just a little bit of background about me. I've had the privilege of starting and leading privacy programs at 3 separate companies, initially Dow Jones, then Avon, and more recently coming in to lead the privacy program at Pfizer. Going back to a point in the last panel, I think all 3 companies have a culture of compliance, or at least they did when I was there. I can't speak to before or after, but a very sincere desire to do the right thing and a culture of compliance. And it remains difficult. And this won't be news to anybody, but it remains difficult to deal with the labyrinth of different laws in the over 100 countries in which we have on-the-ground business presence, to deal with the conflicting laws, often conflicting with US laws, and to deal with the different cultures and sensitivities to privacy and sensitivities to risk. So it's great that Microsoft sits down and thinks about how to work with their customers on these issues. But if hypothetically I were rolling out a cloud solution from Microsoft, for example, say the 365 solution for email and for other types of storage, I would be trying to work through the issues with my labyrinth of business clients and lawyers across these countries. And their reaction would really differ depending upon the culture. Some people would shrug, and other people would start talking to me about how to work this through with works councils and make sure employees would approve all of this. And I think the point is the implementation, the practical implementation on the ground remains very complicated. I think in terms of it being complicated, going back to the point you made about partnering with your engineers, that's not just true in the cycle of developing technology. I think the key to operationalizing privacy and to effective governance is making sure there's a lot of communication between the business and the privacy counsel, the privacy officer. That's hard to do, and that's hard to achieve in terms of governance too. So I've had the experience of setting up governance committees at 3 different companies, and it's really hard to get the right representation of people from different business lines, different geographies, to bring all those thoughts together and really make effective governance. And so I think that we still have this tension between how do we comply with these laws across the world, and how do we do that? How do I make sure, because I see my job as making sure that we use personal information in compliance with all relevant laws, but still enable our strategic business initiatives to go forward and succeed. And how do we tie all that together remains a challenge.
Well, how do you do it?
I have questions, not answers. So I think the way in which we do that is to put in place policies and procedures globally that try to create a uniform standard based on common denominators in the law, but have room for exceptions locally so that if you need to do something differently in a particular country, you can. But there's a loss of business efficiency. There's a loss of, there's a financial drain in doing that. And it can be very time-consuming. So from the point in time where you go to launch a new initiative to the point in time where you can actually roll it out can really be derailed by working through these exceptions across the world.
Anyone else? Specifics on how to implement? Bill?
Sure. I guess as a hotel company, We also operate in over 100 countries around the world. Actually, more than half of our business is outside the US. So when I created the privacy function back at late 2002, which is a really long time ago, a lot of the challenges that we face today were not even there. But I think going into it, we decided that we would not have a particular geographic focus. And really, the way that I've run my privacy program is that there's a legal compliance aspect of it, but to be quite honest, most of my focus is on consumer expectations. So whenever I deal with projects, with decisions that need to be made, it's always through the lens of our consumer. I mean, we are a B2C customer. If I did not have guests who wanted to stay at our hotels, it would be really, really bad for our business. So I think the practical side of this is that when I get pulled into negotiations with various corporate entities, that I view my role as almost the custodian to ensure that the rights of our consumers, of the individuals, are things that are being properly addressed. And if that requires things that are above and beyond the particular legal requirements in a jurisdiction or even, let's say, the EU, then if it's the right thing to do, then that's the business case for us is in the long term. We need to manage that. You know, it's sort of, for me, the legal compliance aspect is sort of the point of entry, but we need to really differentiate ourselves beyond what other companies are doing in the space.
If you're saying that if you meet consumer expectations, you think you'll meet the different legal requirements?
I think if we meet, I think the legal requirements, there's a lot of things in there that are basic principles. I mean, whether you look at things on the safe harbor principles, on generally accepted privacy principles, EU requirements, APAC, anything, if you stand back and you read all of those things, these are things that every company should be doing. So I think sort of saying you're going to comply with law is kind of a given. I mean, if you're not doing that, that's pretty basic. And any company that's not at least starting at that point is really short-sighted.
So I actually want to take a step back even further.
All right.
And we for those of you who don't, I recently joined Marsh and McLennan. We're a B2B business, unlike my two colleagues here. Our clients are companies, your companies, not individuals. But I think the challenge that we really face here, and all of you have sort of touched on it, but to say it more in a slightly different way, we have a disconnect between the laws, which are territorial in nature. We can't agree as a global community on anything. We don't have a single definition of what is personal data. We don't agree on the definition of sensitive data. We don't agree on what are transfers, who is a controller, who is a processor. So basic elements of privacy are not agreed upon globally. And the laws are territorial. The regulators are turfish in the sense that, at least in the US, it's financial services or healthcare services or children or other things, but there's no sort of pan-data regulator like a DPA in Europe. And then data just flows globally. So the data doesn't stop at the border and show a passport or open its suitcase and stand for an inspection. The data just moves. So you have that disconnect between data and law. And then you have processes, which, again, in some cases are local, but in many cases are global. And companies have to build global processes. And you cannot build a process that says, well, I'm going to process my data from France. And sort of like Bill, we operate in 140 countries. So we can't have 140 processes for one operational thing. We have one global process. So how do you map a process to different definitions, different laws, different expectations? And then you get to culture, as Patrice said, because in different parts of the world, and we've heard this morning, different people have different views of privacy. In Europe, it's a fundamental right. In the US, it's not. In Latin America, they have a different view to privacy. In Asia, they have a different view to privacy. In fact, many countries have passed privacy laws for political reasons, to try and get an adequacy finding for Europe for outsourcing purposes. But it's not a real core thing that the person in the street really cares about. So trying to map different cultures, different processes, different laws, and the data flowing globally into one coherent program is the ultimate challenge. And So I know, I'm just about to shut up, but I know you're going to ask me, so how do you do it?
Yes.
And the answer is it's very hard. And sort of like Bill and Patrice and others, all you can do is sort of try to build some kind of global framework that you think will meet the vast majority of these basic components. And then you can have, in some cases, you can have some local nuances. And in some cases, we're probably doing things that are not fully mapped to the local requirements because you can't.
Yeah, you have to build one framework that hopefully will work everywhere. You've got to monitor locally to, there may be some country somewhere with something that's a little bit different,
Yep.
and you might have to deviate somewhat in that locality, is what I'm hearing.
I was going to
Katherine.
step back a little bit to part of what your first question was, which is basically the alphabet soup of laws that we have in the states. And as a former regulator, as a person who used to bring cases, who wrote rules and was engaged in policy, I would suggest that nothing is really ever as easy as it seems. No law enforcement case is ever a slam dunk, because the way the statute or the rule is written, it's sometimes difficult to figure out how the company works or what the facts are that make it an actionable violation, for example. When the commission is engaged in rulemakings, and normally that's when Congress tells the commission, because the agency itself has no inherent rulemaking authority in this area, they try to do the right thing by having flexible standards, no one size fits all, partly because the number of entities that the FTC regulates is in this space is very small companies, and then everybody else except for the people it doesn't regulate, which are banks and insurance companies, essentially. But I had a glimmer of how hard this is to comply even before I left the FTC. A few years ago, I was deploying the disposal rule. Now, that sounds like the simplest, best-intentioned rule of the world. Congress, in fact, Senator Nelson, there was a news show in Florida that said that someone had found a bunch of consumer reports in a dumpster. And he said, there ought to be a law, and so they amended the Fair Credit Reporting Act. They were doing other things as well, and said to the commission that they had to do a disposal rule. And it was a requirement that any entity that had a consumer report, when they disposed of it, had to dispose of it in such a way so that it couldn't be glued together, and so that identity thieves wouldn't be able to have access to the information in a consumer report. Now, the rule was interesting because it had joint and several liability for whoever created the record, whoever transported the record, it was kind of like the Superfund, and whoever disposed of the record. And I was answering a lot of calls from businesses, and they would just say, so how big should I shred, or how small must I shred it? And I said, I don't know. I mean, the rule was intentionally written not to be obsolete. So it didn't give precise standards for compliance. So fast forward, leave the commission. I've been at Hogan for about 6 months, and I now even more clearly understand the challenges that companies have trying to figure out if they fit within the very specific definitions of the alphabet soup of the privacy laws that we have in this country. But I must say, I do think that companies do want to do the right thing. And then I'll say one more thing about what people, because this has been in the news a lot lately, at least in my circles, where a company tried to do the right thing but didn't get it quite right, and is now going to be subject to a commission order. And Chairwoman Ramirez talked about the NOMI settlement that is out for public comment. What's interesting about that case was the company had no obligation to provide an opt-out notice in their privacy policy, but they chose to do so. Their privacy policy said, and this was a retail tracking operation, so their privacy policy said you can opt out online or you can opt out at the retail locations that use our device. Only they couldn't opt out at the retail locations that use the device because that never was implemented. So the commission challenged that this conduct was deceptive and has, required that they now not make misrepresentations in their privacy policies. It's not yet a final order. It's out for public comment, but two commissioners dissented from this because they thought it sent the wrong message to punish a company for trying to do the right thing but not getting it quite right. So I guess that's my response to the challenge of trying to do what isn't required in order to, when trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, if I can add just one
Sure.
thing to that, I think there's one other point that's interesting. Laws and regulations are often intentionally or unintentionally vague, and engineers and IT people are very precise people. So anyone who wants to have a fun conversation, go find your CISO and say, we have to provide reasonable security, go, right? They're just going to stare at you, right? What do you mean? What's reasonable security? I need to know exactly what I need to do. And when a body like the FTC or other regulators give you these vague terms, intentionally, they either intentionally or unintentionally want to have flexibility. They think they're doing you a favor and giving you the flexibility that you could say, well, it was reasonable not to encrypt under the circumstances. But IT people who need to turn something into action find it very hard to do. And then again, dealing with different regulators who have different perspectives on what's reasonable or what is appropriate in a certain circumstance adds yet another level of complexity.
And sometimes the legislators and the regulators want to leave it to the courts to figure out. But did you want to add something?
I was going to say, I certainly agree with Orrie, and I see that in my world with scientists too are also used to thinking very literally, and you talk about the data that we have from clinical trials on how to comply with privacy requirements and best clinical practices. It's very hard for them to understand some of the gray areas around anonymization, de-identification, areas that we're all struggling with, but are particularly hard for them to really comprehend because it is so different than the science that they're used to working with.
Things are either zeros or ones, right? For engineers. I mean, I agree on that. I was going to say one more thing on the alphabet soup. For our businesses, there's some very obscure alphabet soup. I mean, there's has anybody ever heard of CGIS before? This is I got one nod ahead. Wow, that's impressive. So this is the set of requirements, security and privacy requirements that law enforcement authorities in the United States have to comply with information systems requirements. And those are actually things that do pass on to cloud providers. So we actually have to find, that's just one example of dozens and dozens of different sets of alphabet soup requirements. The point I'll make, when people ask me, well, how do you deal with that? And is it just going to be this endless cycle of hundreds of different certifications? So it is very challenging. It taxes our engineers, and all of these questions from like the interpretation issues to once you've interpreted it, just what is the work going to be and how are we going to get it done? But an area where we've really started to do more work kind of in the policy arena is looking for ways in which we can encourage discussions around the similarities of these regulations. And so an area that I've been involved in for over 10 years is international standards and how can standards play a role. And this is probably a non-U.S. discussion in the first instance because I think the U.S. is likely to look at international standards and say, what can an international security standard, how can I map that against federal or state or local regulations? The reality is lots of other countries like to do this, and they particularly like to do this for regulated sectors. So a good example, this is the ISO 27000 series standards, and in particular 27018, which looks specifically at cloud providers who are processors of PII, sets out a set of security and some data protection requirements. And one of the things I like to think about whether this happens or not is both using those as a framework for making sure regulations look more similar than different, but also giving customers and regulatory authorities a third-party audit mechanism. So that's what's great about standards. You have these auditors who come in, and I'm not aware of anyone else who audits against a data privacy type requirement. And so I think there's some real utility and value in those types of efforts, although will give the caveat that I don't see the U.S. authorities as being very interested in that at the moment.
Is there any effort being made to come up with international, and this may be a naive question, but with international standards or an effort to come up with some kind of treaty or that would apply across the world, parts of the world?
On the privacy front?
On the privacy front, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think there isn't. I mean, as we've heard, there's, the European bloc has
Yeah.
one regime, and APEC is trying to play in a different way. The Latin Americans, we've just heard today, are trying to centralize in a different way. The closest I think we've gotten is maybe there's been some talk about some UN-sponsored treaty. There's now a privacy rapporteur that's being appointed by the UN. But again, I just don't see it happening, given that there's no global acceptance of the concept of privacy.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean the same thing to all people around the world. I mean, just go to India, right? So India has a supposed privacy law. It's in the Information Security Act, but they have privacy concepts in there. But it's for outsourcing. The average Indian, they don't treat privacy the way we treat privacy. I mean, they'll put 600 people on a bus. They just have a different concept of privacy. They live 3 generations of family in one room, and they all, might shower together, and so that is not the concept that we think of as privacy. And then the Europeans have a totally different view from us. So how would you get to that sort of global? I don't know.
And you're not aware of any effort being made, other than possibly at the UN? Yeah.
I mean, at most, I mentioned sort of international standards. I think there are less things that countries would adopt and say, this is going to be our set of security and privacy requirements. And they're more sort of an intermediate tool that both companies and customers can use to sort of prove or assert compliance with domestic country regulations. And that doesn't sound all that helpful at first, but it's better than having sort of a de novo audit of every single one of these alphabet soups. It would basically, our engineering teams wouldn't have any time to build. And so, I don't know if I'm explaining it well, but it's sort of a shim in between sort of what the companies do and what the laws are. And it creates it's sort of an interoperability layer between these different laws and the global operations. It's not perfect by any means, but it does help advance on a number of the sort of kernel of issues that regulators care about, some kind of understanding.
Bill?
I guess one of the things that I think it's important to keep in sight is technology enables a lot of things. I mean, cloud computing is much different than when, I guess, well, it used to be outsourced servers, but put a new label on it with cloud service providers. I mean, like most other global companies, we have master agreements in place with Microsoft, with Amazon Web Services. I think some of the challenges come up is not with companies like Microsoft or Amazon. It's with your marketing department who decides they have a real cool initiative that they're going to do. They engage a third-party service provider to build a new app, and then you have no idea what is happening with the data that may potentially be passed to that third provider. They may be using a cloud service provider that doesn't have the same sort of focus, resources, and I guess ability to keep up with the various things. So I think that one thing that's really important in the context of all this is any company still needs to be responsible at the end of the day with what they do with their information, and that you may be able to outsource your technology platforms, but you can't outsource or delegate your responsibility to manage your information assets. So even if we do put things up on AWS or we use Microsoft, I mean, there has to be processes in place where you go through an internal check to ensure that the stuff of data that you're willing to put out there is appropriate to be put outside of your 4 walls. Because if they're the crown jewels, you know what, those are remaining within our walls because I need to have the ability to do the audits, to do the other sorts of oversight that I would feel really uncomfortable outsourcing and then relying on someone else to basically manage my key asset.
What about Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, as Steve mentioned earlier, I actually am one of those people that remember when the commission was telling companies to have privacy policies, that we had to say, whoops, do we have one? And we didn't at the time, but then we did immediately. But that's the kind of thing, there was a disconnect between, and we saw this in privacy policies and companies collecting information early on. There was a disconnect between what the management, the C-suite thought was happening and what the techies could do. I mean, they could do it. They could grab all this data. They could do what, and now I think the corporations, big companies and even small companies have matured more and do take sort of an assessment of the data they have, where it comes from, how they take care of it, and that's happening at a company by company level outside of legal requirements.
So let me add one point on that with
Yes.
privacy policy. So I think when the requirement came up to have a privacy policy up on your website, a lot of lawyers got involved, especially in the US. And if you read most companies' privacy policies, they're written with a lot of leeway on what companies may or may not do with information and who they might share it with. It's sort of a strange evolution that's come around on that, because I think as people become much more sensitive to how their own information is being governed, handled, managed, that they're taking closer looks at that and then starting to push back on it. So I think the evolution that's happening, and I'm actually in the process of doing binding corporate rules. So I just came back from Europe last night after meeting with the regulators. And part of the interesting thing is the whole analysis of your BCR promises, your internal policies versus what you put out publicly, that these things really need to start coming together a lot more tighter, because sort of the leeway that you may have built in for yourself on your public-facing statements, from a regulatory standpoint, they're looking at that and going, well, that really doesn't comply with what you are now telling me your internal practices are.
I mean, what are some of the challenges of, you've got your policy, implementing it, putting it into technical practice? What are some of the particular challenges?
I think big technological challenges, unless you're a brand new company, you have a lot of infrastructure that's already in place there, right? So something as simple as role-based access, like how do you take a system that's been in place for 30 years that was never designed to have that sort of functionality in place to be changed so that you're enabling things that are emerging every single day? I think and if that's difficult for large companies, I can't imagine how smaller companies would be able to do any of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can add
Sure.
actually two other challenges. So I fully agree with Bill. I think that the sort of proliferation of older technology, which was never really built to necessarily interact cohesively, is a challenge. But add to that, many large companies tend to grow by acquisition. Acquisition means new systems that were never meant to play with your old systems. And you're always chasing yourself, because while your IT people are running around and trying to integrate the systems of this company you bought last year, the M&A guys have already bought 2 more companies. So if you're in a company that's expanding, you're always chasing stuff. But the other thing is, and Katherine, I actually disagree a little bit. You just made a point that companies seem to have things more under control. I think it's sort of like a hill, and maybe that was right a few years ago, and we're on the flip side again where we've lost control.
Sisyphus.
Yes.
Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill, and it,
We
yes.
almost got to the top, and suddenly we rolled all the way halfway back down the slope again. Because what's actually changed, and some people call this shadow IT, you can call it whatever nefarious term you want to put in, the days when IT actually controlled what a company did with data are over. Today's day is a day where the end user, I mean the employee, not the client, can make their own decisions. Every person has become their own IT shop. All you need is a credit card, and you can buy some SaaS, software as a service, online, right? You can, the spend can be minimal, because again, a lot of these you purchase them as a service, so it's not like you need a big budget. People put them on their travel card, on their personal card, but you find that data is just proliferating, and you don't even know anymore where it's going until you stumble on it. And so to expect companies to be able to take something like BCR, to take a set of rules and say, I will apply this to all of my data. Yes, I can apply this to all of my data that I know where it is, assuming the systems will allow me to do that, because some systems won't even let me do that. But there's an increasing amount of data that we're just saying, I know it's out there, but I don't know where it is.
Back to the global front, the issue of data localization, countries requiring you to keep a server in the country. To what extent is that a significant issue these days? What can be done about it?
Who wants to piss off the Russians?
I mean, I'll sort of throw it out. I mean, we're sort of a mixed mind about this. I mean, on the one hand, look, we're trying to build hyperscale services. And so the idea of having to put, a data center in every single country that we want to operate in, it doesn't work for that economic model, right? In the beginning, I would say where we started out was thinking probably far fewer than we have, far fewer data centers, that is. We've found that there has to be some sort of mix between this notion that, if you could have one or two or three, sort of intermixing the latency concerns and the scale cost savings, it would be a smaller number than I think most of us have decided to go with. So there is that component of it. But on the other hand, when we think about operating services or providing services for governments, we have to concede that there's a certain amount of data that is within government operations that is simply not, it's not a winnable argument to tell them they should move 100% of their stuff to the cloud. I mean, I know some of my counterparts at other companies continue to try to push that message, but it's simply not a winnable argument. And so, the question really comes down to, in those countries where you can't make the numbers work to build a data center, and there are probably lots of countries where that's the case, what are the systems that you can deploy? It's probably good old-fashioned servers and on-prem software for those customers. And they need to understand, the customers that is, need to understand that some of the benefits, whether they're cost, agility, other things that come with using cloud computing, they're just not going to be available. And they may not, to the extent that the government then passes those regulations down to, its industry, some of those benefits then won't be available to industry as well, because there really is a point at which building a data center in a country is not a economically viable proposition.
Are some countries requiring it?
Yeah, and
For certain data?
right, and so
Yeah.
and on that, let me say, I think Ira and some of the others on the security panel hit on this. Is there are different reasons they're requiring it, right? And it's important to tease those things out as you're thinking about advising your clients and trying to get to a winning business scenario. There's this issue of sensitive business information. I mean, the cloud services we provide to the U.S. government cannot leave the country, right? So we have dedicated cloud here for them. There's the issue beyond that of, quite frankly, the ability to spy on citizens, right? I mean, that was another, maybe that's not the diplomatic way of saying it, but that was something that sort of got teased out of that security. So we want servers in our country so that we can figure out what's going on. And then I think the third element that a number of folks mentioned on that panel as well was this sort of domestic protectionism. So it favors a local, hoster or data center operator who doesn't have anywhere near the sort of economies of scale to really compete with a public cloud company like an Amazon, a Microsoft, or a Google. And so those regulations actually, they're sort of seen as equalizers to give the local business an advantage.
So I actually want to totally disagree with Steve. And I understand Microsoft and why you have to give the answer you gave. But first of all, to answer your question about countries, so we all know about the Russian data localization law. So Russia is one country which is requiring, as of, I believe, October of this year, that companies keep a copy of Russian data locally. A few other countries that I'm aware of that do this, Turkey, I want to say Saudi Arabia, and South Korea would certainly be another place where moving data out of the country is near impossible. So there are definitely a handful of countries that have specific data localization laws. I think there's many other countries that have restrictions on movement of data, so it can move, but it's not easy. But here's the reason I disagree with Steve. I think there's only so many places where you can provide security and scale and control to data to really do the right things that you have to do from a compliance perspective. There's no multinational that's going to operate 100 or 120 or 150 data centers, each one staffed with security people, compliance people, lawyers, and so forth. So companies find 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 12, 15 places where they can offer that kind of scale, and they look to centralize the data. And my view is that every place where you're putting data outside, and I think of these like the castle. These are the castles. These are the ones that we have the moat, and we do all the protections. Every other place that you're putting data is something less. You're automatically saying, I'm not going to give you the level of service and control and security that I have in my data center. And so will I do it if I have to? Yes. But is that the right thing to do? Is that an approach that I should come in and say, I think I should put data in each country? Put aside the operational issues, but from a client perspective, do you really want your data in a place that I can't really control as well as I can in my data center with redundancies and all the other things? I think that's a mistake.
Anyone else on that
I
issue?
think that's a great advertisement for cloud computing. I actually fully agree with you. I fully agree with you. And the only point that I was sort of trying to make on top of that is you do actually run up against some governments where that, you know, what I'm basically saying is, hey, all those benefits you're talking about, you as a customer won't be able to get those, right? Because we can't put a data center in your country. We just can't do it, whether it's for geopolitical reasons or economic reasons. And so I agree. I fundamentally agree that I think the hyperscale cloud has, beyond security, it's got a number of benefits, and countries are going to miss out on those. And I think it's particularly bad where they push what's otherwise just a public sector procurement requirement down and say, hey, by the way, our financial services, our health, other regulated industries in our country bound by the same rules. I think it's fundamentally missing an opportunity for those important industry segments to be able to benefit from these benefits of cloud. So I think in some ways we're on the same page. I just am willing for business purposes to say, there's some places where we're going to concede. We have server products, right? So we can go do that. A number of other companies don't want to make that concession because they don't have an on-prem or, you know, sort of local solution that they can build.
We only have a few more minutes before we want to do questions and answers. But in preparing for this, I am not an expert by any means, but so I'm trying to do some general reading. I'm appalled at how many breaches there are. Many, many breaches, huge losses. There was one website I was looking at. The circles of breaches. You click on one, and it gives you all the details. So corporations are more conscious. The regulators are working harder. There are more policies being written and implemented. Why aren't they working? They don't seem to be working. What more can be done? What is happening here that there continue to be so many of these significant breaches?
I'll give you two answers.
All right.
So number one, we have to get it right 100% of the time. They have to get it right just once. Mm-hmm. They can send out 10 million phishing emails, and they just need one person to click, and they'll go in. Whoever that person is, wherever they are, they click, they'll go in. We have to get it right all the time. So the odds are stacked against us. The second challenge is, again, as I alluded to earlier, the environment has become so complicated, and there's so many moving parts, and data is sitting in so many places, and there's so many users and third parties and vendors. So Target was reportedly hacked through their HVAC vendor. You know, there was a large oil company that was hacked because they put malicious, they knew that there was a Chinese restaurant next to the site, and people were ordering online for takeout from the restaurant, so they infected the menu with malware. so that when they went in and clicked on the link, the malware came in, and that's how they got in. RSA got hacked. They took the tokens from RSA, and then they used that to attack Lockheed. So there's so much interconnectivity, and there's so much dependency. And again, all you have to do is get it wrong once. We have to patch all the time. Our friends at Microsoft have Patch Tuesday, and if they could, they'd have patch every day. And you have zero-day malware, which means the day that they tell you about the issue, it's already live in the wild. And you can't, and if you're running 10,000 servers, you're not going to patch 10,000 servers in a day, because you don't know what the patch is going to do, and it's going to bring something, so you have to test it, and you have to do it carefully. So there's so many things to do to stay on top of the patches and the bugs and everything, and control all your third parties and your stupid employees who might click on something, and all of that. And it's a surprise that we don't have more hacks.
Well, is it a losing proposition? I mean, how do you reduce the odds? We're talking about corporate governance. I mean, what more can be done to make things better, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say it's a reality, and therefore what we really need to work on is how we react to mitigate as quickly as possible and to ensure the least amount of damage is done. And I think that's what companies really need to be focusing on more and more.
That's depressing.
Look, I think, it's, as you've all alluded to, it's such a multi-layer challenge, right? And without even professing to say I know a lot about all the layers, it's everything from, there's some really good news in some fronts. I mean, look at the move towards multi-factor authentication. This is just a great example of removing a very low-hanging way in which, credentials once compromised are good forever and wherever. With multi-factor authentication, which a lot of corporates are starting to use now, we use it very heavily at Microsoft for our own internal purposes. And it used to strike me as just crazy that I could go to a public computer, put my login name and my password there, and then that was good, right? I didn't need an additional multi-factor token to say, this is good on this machine for the session we're in right now. That's basically very, very high level overview of it. So there's innovations like that. Another layer, you mentioned sort of, Patch Tuesday. Hey, our future vision is that doesn't, that it's happening all the time, right? This idea that we're in, 2015 and we're still delivering operating system technology the same way we were delivering it in the 90s, it's a challenge for our customers, it's a challenge for us. But then if you go to sort of deeper layers, I mean, this is where I do think I see a lot of breaches where it's just like somebody set up a public website and they just, they set up a website and they didn't even put the settings right to, make it secure. And this is where I think, cloud providers will be able to provide a level of security at scale not against that stuff, right? Not against somebody setting something up wrong with the wrong permissions. But if you get the right permissions, you do the right sort of training, the ability to hack into those systems will be, I believe, reduced. And so, a lot of this is, it's different people with different responsibilities and not something you can solve all at once, but I do see, really good practices that are helping lower the risks.
Yeah, I think the additional thing that I would add to that is we go through a lot of exercise now where we're trying to do a lot of data minimization. So even if people got into your systems, really you need to question why you have certain data in there anyway from the get-go, right? So a lot of it is that sort of exercise.
Collect less data.
Or
It's
Will-
the, it's
will
the
companies-
right, it's the governance
will
and the
companies
data
do
management
that?
aspects of this is question why are we capturing it? What's the purpose for it? How long should we be keeping it for? How do we get rid of it? Who do we share it with? I mean, all of these things that sound pretty simple, a lot of companies just don't do. I think that's part of it. Is the reality is every company is going to get breached. I mean, people go in. It's not even the nation states. It's not just the organized crime anymore. What you find on these underground forums now are you don't even need to be a computer expert anymore. The models are already, the tools are already built and available online where you could take credentials that were taken from someone else's breach, dump the list into this tool, go out and hit every single website that you could name, and then a certain percentage of those credentials are going to work, And then, so these are college kids that are also doing this sort of stuff where they're ordering gift cards, right? So they're redeeming these things, and then the parents, the way that they get caught is a package arrives at their house and there's 1,000 like Amazon gift cards sitting at the front door, and the mother and father are like, what are all these gift cards for? I mean, it's that sort of challenge of the technology. So a lot of it is you should be figuring out what you even have in your systems and why it's there and how do you protect that stuff.
And Orrie, that's what I meant when I thought, what I've learned since joining the private sector is that a lot of companies want to do the right thing. They want to start the best practices internally and go through the assessment process, the exercise process, the governance process. But having spent all that time at the FTC, you can never underestimate how clever the bad guys are. And how they are always often one step ahead in different kinds of fraud and technology. But there's also vulnerable and opportunistic entities. Just earlier this year, there was a payday lending site. Consumers were inputting information to try to get payday loans. And that data was being collected. I mean, this is really sensitive, very, information about these consumers. And these were very vulnerable consumers as well. That data was being collected from this website and sold to predatory lenders for loan repair and other kinds of predatory loans. So, I mean, consumers have to also be smart about what they put out there.
Yeah, and just one thing, because Patrice mentioned it in passing, but I think it's a crucial point. The point that there's too much emphasis on the fact that companies get hacked and not enough emphasis on the question of how have they responded and what have the hackers actually taken. Because what's interesting, if you look, for instance, at the Anthem breach, 80 million individuals affected, but the data they took was fairly limited. The JP Morgan breach, that was also, again, I think 76 million, all they took was email addresses. Now, we don't know. Maybe that's all they targeted. Email addresses have tremendous value. But the key is to find them quickly. The worst breaches are the ones where they're in your system for months, and in some cases for years, right? So finding them quickly, being able to block them from exfiltrating the data out of your network, because the fact that they're in and they're holding a bag full of socials doesn't mean they're not there yet, right? It's like being in the vault in the bank holding that sack of cash. You still have to get out the door, right? So if you can prevent them from walking out the door, then it's, in effect, you've won, because the fact that they got in is not as relevant. So we should really not lose sight of the fact that just hearing about all these companies that get hacked doesn't necessarily mean that we've lost the war.
Why don't we open it up to questions from the audience?
Very interesting conversation. My name is Anna Slomovic. Question for you. I spent some time in companies that operated in multiple states in the U.S., including one that operated in every state and Puerto Rico. So it is not just an international coordination problem. Multi-state companies that are subject to state law have the same kinds of problems internally in the U.S. as well as internationally. And in some areas, what we see is what they call a California effect. Sort of everybody drifts sort of towards what California requires, because in many cases, they require stricter protections. So for the first time, not long ago, I was talking to some Europeans, and they said, well, we're hoping for the Brussels effect, so that the US and everybody else is going to kind of drift towards the EU data protection regime. You see any possibility of that, or how do you think about this, if at all?
I think the practice part of it is a lot of companies have already drifted that way. So as an example with what you'll call the Brussels effect. So when I get in discussions as far as what the rights are associated with particular individuals, the way that I explain it is if the person is in Europe, I don't care where they travel throughout their systems, those sort of fundamental rights travel with that guest. So if they're staying in New York versus Brussels, Paris, wherever it is, you sort of have that package of things that you need to abide by. And if you start looking at it that way, from an operational reality standpoint, you're going to wind up managing data at a very, very high level because it's impossible to take multi-million number of people and then try to trigger by state and by country like what their rights would be when they're landing or leaving certain places. I mean, I think the effect is already there for most multinational companies.
Anyone else?
I would just say I think that's a very consumer approach. I don't think that's true of B2B companies. We're definitely not viewing Brussels as the way to go.
Is your hand up, Joel? No. Yeah.
So I thought this was a fascinating conversation. One piece that was missing, though, that I'd like to pose to the panel is the role of the C-suite and the board of directors of a corporation. How do you see them playing into the kinds of operationalization of data privacy that you were talking about? Should they be paying attention? If so, how much? How do you get their attention? Where should they be sitting?
I mean, I can say, yes, they should be, they are. I mean, our execs look at the issue, or the broad issue around trust. Basically, our general counsel probably says, 5 times a week, if our customers don't trust our services, they won't use them. And that goes all the way up to the top of the company. And so, at least from our standpoint as a cloud service provider, our execs are, they're thinking about more than just, what are the engineering nuts and bolts? What are the sales nuts and bolts? I think the trust around privacy and security is one of the sort of key 5 issues probably for our senior execs.
Yeah, I would say the cyber issue, definitely. I think privacy, again, it depends on whether it's core to your business. And again, on the consumer side, you're probably going to have a lot more of a privacy impact or the privacy differentiator component than in a business that's less driven by data. If you're in the manufacturing space, again, and you're just selling, like, my old company, GE, if all you're selling is big iron chunks of stuff to big companies, whether it's engines or turbines or other, rail cars, the privacy issues are not going to be board level issues. They're not, they don't rise to that level of strategic value. Cyber will be. Cyber, I think at this point, every boardroom is probably discussing. But the interesting thing is, I call it the Wall Street Journal effect, because no matter what you want to tell the board, they're going to want to know about what they read in the journal that morning.
Right, and I guess they're facing the one of the things we didn't talk about in the data breach context is the lawsuits that happen, the state actions, the FTC actions, or the class actions that can be devastating. And also, I guess there's some where they've sued the directors and stuff as well, because they should have known.
There are always these mismanagement cases where the board members are sued individually, and so yes, the board ought to be discussing these issues.
Yes, so I think that to Orrie's point, it probably also depends on the industry. We're a consumer company. It's something that's pretty important. I mean, I was fortunate that when we established the position, it was placed pretty high in the organization. I'm 2 steps below the CEO of the company, so from a reporting standpoint, very high level. I report to the board of directors every quarter on both enterprise risk, privacy, and security matters, so it's something that they are apprised of on an ongoing basis, and obviously if we had something bad happen at the company, my email, my BlackBerry would probably be triggered pretty quickly, inquiring what's going on. So I think that that's been a positive in my experience at my organization. I think if the function gets buried too far down, then it really doesn't get the type of attention that it probably needs, especially in particular industries.
And I would agree with all of that. I would say that when it comes to cyber, you have board of directors who are also very interested in our intellectual property. And so therefore, protecting the crown jewels and protecting personal information become one and the same. And I think there's a lot of interest in the cyber area because of that.
Yes.
I'm Gina Anderson. So in the last few years, there's been a rush to purchase cybersecurity insurance for Orrie. how much of a remedy is that? To shift the risk to insurance, by purchasing insurance, will the cost just be passed on? What are the issues with cybersecurity insurance?
Yep. So, I mean, that's a huge topic, and I'm not going to try to answer it in depth, but I'll say two things. So, number one, there is an increasing trend of companies purchasing cyber insurance, and part of it is a result of a trend of insurance companies adding exclusions to their usual, property and casualty and E&O and other policies, CGLs, to eliminate cyber coverage. So that's an interesting trend that we're seeing. But we believe, and we're not an insurance company, to those of you, sometimes people get confused, we are an insurance broker. One of our businesses is an insurance broker. We think that there's tremendous value, and actually the US government agrees, and we're working closely with quite a few departments on this point. When you purchase a new home and you buy homeowner's insurance, one of the things that the homeowner insurance does is they check your house for safety, right? They ask you, do you have water sprinklers? Do you have an alarm system? How far are you from the closest fire hydrant? How close are you to the nearest fire department? Because they're trying to understand what is the risk of your house suffering a fire or some other damage, and what can you do to mitigate that damage, and then they insure you accordingly. What's interesting, I think people don't focus on, is the process of getting cyber insurance actually forces you to clean up your act and to do things, because they ask you questions and they start going to you and saying, well, why do you have all this data? And why don't you have security? And why don't you have a CISO? And why does your this sit here and not there? And so in the process of applying and qualifying for cyber insurance, you go through a sort of cleansing process that actually improves your security. So if you just think of cyber insurance as a cost-shifting exercise, then you're missing part of the value.
Anyone else on insurance? No? Yes, last question.
Thank you. My name is Lauren James, and I'm with Thomson Reuters, and I'm in 100 countries as well, like all of you. And I want to hear your opinion on moving to a risk-based approach. We talked about how all the countries are different, and it's hard to comply with every single one of them in every single instance. So have you brought in more of a risk model when you analyze the biggest, the lowest hanging fruit versus the highest risk items when you're prioritizing your programs?
I guess the short answer would be yes, since I have two roles at my company. I'm the head of enterprise risk management and also the chief privacy officer. So in my day-to-day activities, that is what I do. And I think that, to your point, you do need to identify all the universe of risks that are out there, but then you have to prioritize. I mean, companies do not have endless amounts of money, time, resources to do that. So you have to go through an exercise to figure out what are those things that are going to give you the most bang for your buck. No company out there is going to become 100% secure. So part of the exercise is also, all right, against other competitors, sort of what am I going to do to sort of make it harder for the bad guys to come and target my company versus going down the street and going after someone else. I think that's the reality of some of those exercises.
Yeah, I'll just say, I mean, I actually report to our chief risk officer as well. So I think risk is a key part. Each company has a set of risks. Privacy is going to be one of them. It might be the first, might be the second, might be the 10th. And as Bill said, everyone who works at a company knows that there's finite resources, even at Microsoft, although they're in a better place than most of us. And so you have to sort of juggle, right? So if you have other risks that are bigger risks and you have to focus on them, then by definition, less resources and management attention will be devoted to the privacy issues. But if you are in a consumer business, a data-rich business, then hopefully the privacy issues are high up on the radar of management, and it's a high risk for the company, and enough resources are spent.
I think most companies are doing this, if not directly through a privacy group, through their enterprise risk management programs, and they're looking at the risks across the company in that fashion. I'm part of the legal division, not part of a risk association, but I do sit on the enterprise risk management committees to talk about privacy and security.
I think that's a really interesting question also, but I think about it in terms of what the role of government or laws and regulations are, and when the data security or privacy legislation starts being enacted, is it going to be a risk-based model, or is it going to be different?
Steve, you started us off. Do you want a final word?
No additional comments. I sort of agree with all of the participants. I mean, there's very, and I don't have much more to say other than, yeah, I mean, look, you've got just so many different sets of rules out there. You eventually have to prioritize things. You just sort of can't solve for every issue, so.
All right, well, thank you very much.